Hi, my name is Lewis Scott. I'm a naturalist with the City of Oklahoma City Parks and Recreation Department, and today we're going to be discussing ways that you can reduce yard waste. And usually when you use the term yard waste, most people automatically think of grass clippings from their lawn, but there are many other ways that the landscape can potentially produce yard waste. Today we're going to talk about some of those potential things that can produce waste around your yard, and then we're also going to discuss some methods where you can reduce or possibly eliminate those sources of waste. Although luscious plantings may be visually attractive, one of the things we have to remember about this sort of aesthetic is the amount of yard waste potential that a landscape plan such as this can generate. There are also other unforeseen factors that may come into play, such as an increase in pest and disease issues because of essentially what amounts to an overplanting. You can also, to the right here, notice that it can also cause problems with other structures in the landscape, such as drives or sidewalks, if plants are not spaced out appropriately enough to give each individual plant its unique space to grow to maturity. There's a couple of things that you can do to avoid an overplanting situation. One of the first things that you can do is read and pay attention to the actual label that comes with the plant material, which describes its ultimate mature height and width, and then space out your design accordingly to those dimensions. In that way, you're really looking at about a 3 to 5 year plan for these plants to gradually fill in and actually occupy the space. Here's an example of a planting that was installed with a 3 to 5 year growth plan in mind. You can see where there is still space between individual specimens of plants, and what that does is, again, really reduces the amount of clippings that would have to be made or prunings that would have to be done in order to give each plant its individual space. And again, this has the added advantage of the plant gets as much light and nutrients as it needs without encroachment from its neighbors. That also cuts down on your pest and disease issues as well. Although this bed may appear empty with a lot of space, this is actually a good example of a 3 to 5 year planting plan. These are 2 knockout roses. They were planted as small 1-gallon plants initially, but as you can see with the spacing here, that eventually they will grow to fill in the space over the course of 3 to 5 years and require little to no pruning. Here's another example of a culprit in the landscape that can produce a lot of yard waste, and that is formal hedges. There's a couple of things that you can think about doing in order to reduce the amount of waste that a formal hedge produces. And of course, we call these formal hedges because we tend to shear them or clip them and keep them in nice, tidy shapes. 2 things that you can do. One is make sure that when you do your pruning, you time it at the right season so that the plant has a flush of growth, it's done, you prune, and then no more regrowth. The second thing that you might want to consider doing is totally removing the plant, because part of the reason why we're doing this is because it's actually too large for the space where it's growing. So we could consider removing the plant altogether and replacing it with another kind of plant as a hedge that would require no pruning, simply because it will grow to fill this space only and no more. Here's a good example of an informal hedge. It requires little to no pruning, thus generating very little to no yard waste. It's left to grow to its own devices, to its natural size and shape, without any intervention. Here's another good example of an informal hedge, which is this flowering crepe myrtle. It's a variety called Tonto. You can see again, this is a 5 to 3 year planting where it's been spaced out. You can see there's plenty of light and air so that the crepe myrtles are flowering all over the entire shrub, and it produces very little waste at the end of the season because, again, the plants have been spaced out and given appropriate room so that they do not require pruning, therefore generating yard waste. Another source of yard waste is annual color. These cannas are really beautiful with lush foliage and vibrant color, but at the end of the season, when the first frost or freeze comes, they will die back to the ground, turn brown, and have to be trimmed and hauled away. One way to incorporate this sort of annual color is you may consider planting 5 or 15 of them in a spot in your bed, and then moving some distance down a few feet and planting another group of 10 or 15, thereby reducing the total amount of waste but still incurring large amounts of color within your planting. This same principle works well with other kinds of annual color. Even small bedding plants such as petunias, periwinkles, begonias, larger foliage plants such as ornamental sweet potato vines and the like. You really should think about incorporating those in such a way that, as opposed to a mass, they are simply a very bright star player within that planting. Therefore, at the end of the season when they need to be removed, there's not such a large volume of waste that occurs at the same time. Another source of yard waste is tree pruning. One way that this waste can be reduced is, at the outset of planting your trees, is to make sure that you do the regular maintenance pruning as they grow into the landscape setting rather than after the fact. There's a maintenance schedule that you want to follow, which is once the tree has been planted, you want to wait 2 to 3 years for the tree to establish and then gradually either limb up the tree if needed, or to make sure that when you do prune, you try to never remove more than 25 to 30% of the total canopy space in order not to stimulate the tree into overgrowth or overproduction or weaken the tree, which in turn, again, could potentially produce a large amount of yard waste. Again, the key word for reducing yard waste is spacing. Space your plants upon initial planting in such a way that it allows them enough room for 3 to 5 years worth of growth, and then very little to no pruning will be required, thus eliminating a large portion of yard waste. If you ever have any questions on this topic or others related to horticulture, the City of Oklahoma City Parks Department offers free classes and tours at Will Rogers Gardens at the Garden Exhibition Building. Our phone number here is 943-0827. All of our classes and tours are free. We do require pre-registration.